Hey, it's Reading Adam here. I wanted to make a video about can books make you smarter? I've seen a lot of stuff on YouTube. I've seen a lot of articles, lots of things where people are talking about how books can make you smarter, they're good for your brain, etc. And I don't want to be a contrarian, but I'm somebody who has read a lot of books, and I wanted to just put in my input on this. And I was thinking about this earlier today, and I was thinking, what is it to be, what do you mean by smart? What do people mean by being smarter? Do you mean that you can calculate better math? Do you mean your logic is better? Your understanding of logic through what's been learned with philosophy? Because I don't think anyone studies that anymore, even philosophers. Logical fallacies, rhetoric or dialectic, which if you don't know what those are, then I would say that you're not a book reader. But those are basically, rhetoric is how influential and convincing you can be through speech, through words. Think of memes, and think of your basic speeches like this. This is rhetoric. Dialectic is a formal argument, and almost nobody does that anymore. And those who do it, it's kind of fruitless because most people can't follow it. It requires a lot of knowledge and specialization. Is that the kind of smart that we're talking about with book reading? Are we talking about just somebody who has a lot of vocabulary, that they understand words very well? I mean, that would seem to be getting closer to the point, because language is how books are communicated, unless it's a picture book, which nobody really thinks of picture books. If you read a lot of picture books, are you getting smarter by reading a lot of picture books? I don't know of anybody who would say that, yeah, you're getting smarter. But yet there are art books out there. There are books that show diagrams and graphs and forms of pictures that are used for learning. So that is something, rather than just simply children's books. But even children's books are supposed to have some kind of information that should be valuable, that a lot of children's books advertise as, or there's some kind of meta knowledge to a children's book that you can learn from and study about literature, about language, and so on. Or taking another angle, what if you're reading a children's book that is in another language that you're trying to learn? Are you thereby getting smarter by reading a children's book because you're using it as a tool to learn a new language? When people talk about getting smarter, are they talking about just your brain is making more connections, therefore you're smarter? I suspect that is what people are talking about. People seem to say or suspect that the more connections your brain neurons make with each other, the more information you can access when you're thinking and when you're talking. The more parts of your brain light up, and that this can lead to creativity. And creativity is a form of intelligence that not everybody has similar degrees of. It's one thing to be able to solve math problems. It's another thing to be able to solve math problems no one else has solved, to invent new math. So that's a different form of what we call genius. But can you learn to do that from reading books? I don't think, I don't know. I think that the answer is no one knows. But the way that I see books and the way that I view books as a form of increasing one's intelligence, making one smarter, is the reason that Harold Bloom states in his book on why read. I think that was the book, Why Read or How to Read, something like that. In the very beginning, you get the most important piece of information in his book, which is, why do you read a bunch of books? Because you can't possibly talk to everyone. And books allow us to talk to people across the world and across time and space. So you can read something by somebody who's been long dead, just like how now we can watch videos of people who are long dead, explaining their thinking, explaining their writings. Like the other day, I was listening to some of the interviews, very preciously short clips, interviews of J.R.R. Tolkien, and I wanted more. I wanted to be able to hear the guy talk more, because I could tell there was an insane amount of depth of intelligence to this man that is lost to the world, because there's only so many biographies. There's only so much information one can gather about an individual. And interviews, the way, even just the cadence, the way they speak, the words they choose, their thinking, their reasoning, as you continue to dissect it, it just delves further into the intelligence of this being that you otherwise will never be able to access. If Tolkien did not write his literature that became popular, The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, I would not be able to. I would never know about hobbits. I would never know about his version of orcs and elves. I would never have access to this beautiful story, and I would never. I wouldn't have access to the fantasy genre at all, because maybe the fantasy genre wouldn't be what it is today, because if Tolkien didn't exist, if books didn't exist. I mean, if books didn't exist, there would be no fantasy genre of which we speak. But obviously books are important, because if you imagine a world without books, you imagine people to be far less intelligent than they are, or far less smarter than they are. To try to stay with this word smart. So I can't say books don't teach any of us anything, even though I have read many, many, many books myself. I cannot perceive if I've gotten smarter by reading books. I feel that I get smarter by thinking, by speaking, by doing. Through action do I feel smarter. And usually it's not smarter in that I think I've increased my level of intelligence, but rather I've increased my understanding of one particular thing that I'm thinking about or studying. Or doing, like if I am actually taking an action on something that I am learning. So it's one thing recently I've been learning more about cleaning, and it's one thing to learn that an acid is good for cleaning, non-organic material and a base or an alkaloid is good for cleaning a organic material. It's one thing to think that, and to read it and to understand, okay, baking soda, slightly alkaline, vinegar, highly acidic, and these are your clean, and then water and soap is basically neutral. First, I would have to know what pH is to understand acid and base. But do I really? I mean, all I have to know is baking soda for organic material, grease, oils, proteins, and vinegar for non-organic. Like, I don't need to understand what pH is, what it stands for. I don't really have to understand what an acid or a base is. And I couldn't tell you right now. Like, if you asked me, what is an acid? I think it has something to do with ions, but I don't know. I mean, off the top of my head, I don't know. But I do understand that, hey, when I clean with vinegar, I'm able to get that rust stain off of this material that I'm working on. And then if I decide to do a lot of cleaning, it's just embedded in my brain. Does that make me smarter? I mean, that's just kind of a knowledge that other humans have already figured out that I'm simply imitating. That's a monkey see, monkey do, monkey think kind of thing. And that's what books are at large. Like Harold Bloom said, you can't possibly talk to everybody. You can't speak to every expert in every field, especially because even if you could technically speak to somebody, they might not have the time for you. They might not be accessible. Or when they are accessible, you are not accessible. So you read their book. You read what they have already learned and have put down in book form. And you can read people's I like reading biographies and autobiographies because I feel like I can learn from somebody who's already lived an entire human life. And we seem to learn a lot through our lives. I feel like I know a lot more about living life and being a human being at my age now than when I was a kid, than when I was a teenager. Even a few years ago, I feel like every year that passes, I gain a lot more knowledge, but I'm not really smarter. Smarter would seem to be related to the ability to more efficiently gain knowledge, more efficiently enact or act through your knowledge, to take knowledge that you have absorbed and to be able to apply it in some sort of manner. And I don't think I've gotten better at that per se. The only thing that seems to enhance my ability to be smart in that fashion is patience, is willing to take my time with something, willing to sit down and say to myself, this is going to take time to learn and understand. And that in and of itself increases my brain power right there. Of course, being, not starving, being alive and healthy seems to help a lot. I took an IQ test. I've never taken an official IQ test, so I have no idea what my official IQ would be. And I think in order to have the most accurate IQ test, I believe I've heard or read that you need to take it when you're a child. And I never did. But of the Mensa IQ test, I took it a few times and I got two separate scores, and one score was 110, one score was 132. And the reason for the difference between my scores is that when I got the lower score, the whole IQ test was about manipulating shapes in your mind, being able to see a shape and turn it and adjust it to find a pattern. So I could only get so far because there were 3 rows. It was a grid of like a 3x3 grid, so a grid of 9. There were 3 rows, and then there were 3 columns. And the first 10 questions, every single pattern was easily solvable through looking at the row. But then it suddenly became much more difficult. And it became much more difficult because without informing you and without it being listed in the instructions, the patterns started to become solvable by looking at the columns. But I was trying to force solve them by looking at the rows. So I got a lower score when I tried to force solve the harder stuff by looking at the rows where there wasn't a pattern. What ended up happening is when I realized you could solve the problems either by looking at the patterns on the rows or the patterns on the columns, or even the patterns of everything together. It got more complicated as you got higher in the questions. I did much better. Several standard deviations better. So my thinking is if your thinking is narrow, such as I must force solve this through rows, your IQ, your smartness is going to be 2 standard deviations less than what your actual intelligence is most likely if you are able to think of something completely outside of the box, if you are able to tackle something from every angle and direction. Now, that was for just manipulating shapes. I know that in the popular vernacular, in the online sphere, that there are the word cells and I believe it's not shapeshifters. There's some other word for people who are good at manipulating shapes, these spatial intelligence types. But there appears to be two. People seem to recognize some people have really good verbal intelligence, and some people have really good abstract thinking intelligence. I don't know if book reading can really increase any of that. Because some things, there is no prior knowledge, right? And that's our geniuses tend to be people who are able to bring all of mankind forward through something that no one has figured out before, and they're breaking new ground with original creative thinking, whether it's logical, abstract, whether it's verbal. So that's kind of what I am gearing towards here. Can books make you smarter? I think you can get a lot of information from books, but you don't know what to do with that information. The book can't tell you how to use the information. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a book. It would be a set of instructions. And we get plenty of those. There are plenty of instruction manuals out there. How to fix your car, how to make a fire, how to cook a piece of food, even how to think, like A has to equal A, or B has to follow A, or something like that, the pure logic. So instructions seem to be able to increase one's ability to maybe think about how to think about something, but knowledge itself, it's up to you to figure out how to utilize the knowledge. So two people reading the same book won't always respond in the same way. And one person reading War and Peace is going to understand it differently than another person reading War and Peace, who will both understand it differently from somebody who's reading War and Peace in the original Russian and can understand the original Russian, because it's going to be a different book. So can books make you smarter? I don't think so. I think your ability to use the knowledge of books is highly limited. I read this book, and I do want to do a review on this sometime. This book called How to Read a Book by Mortimer Adler, and I forget the other guy. There was a second guy involved in it. And I believe they were psychologists. I believe I think they were psychologists. I don't recall. And that's another thing where we can hallucinate when it comes to books. We can hallucinate knowledge because I don't necessarily remember everything from everything I read. And just like ChatGPT hallucinates information and just comes up with something because it has to give you an answer, I think humans do that too. And even books can do that. Not everything in a book is 100% accurate. So I read this book, How to Read a Book, and he just gives you techniques. He doesn't... Yes, with reading comprehension, maybe you can understand something much better than somebody who's not paying attention, who's not spending time trying to understand something in depth. And I think that there are techniques and ways one can understand a book better. I think there are ways that one can get more from a text. You can wrestle with a text. You can think about it. You can force yourself to disagree with the author and try to justify why you disagree, or try to explain why you agree with them. There's a lot of things one can do with a book, but many people just take a book, they read it, and then they're done. They don't think about it. So if you're going to be smart, if you want books to make you smarter, then you must think about the book as you read. And unfortunately, it's going to be slow. You can't just power through a bunch of books and gain anything. I tried that and I learned that doesn't work. It's not worth it. It's better to read much slower, take your time with something. If you want to get to other books, then pause the book you're reading and start reading another book. There's no rule that says you must finish one book before you go to the next book. That's, again, going back to that IQ test, like that's trying to force solve everything by just looking at the patterns in the rows. You're going to be a lot dumber if you try it that way. So books are not something that must be read one specific way. Think of when you write. When you write something, you're trying to be clear. You're trying to make your writing understandable, maybe entertaining. Sometimes you might write something and you think, I didn't explain that clear enough, or the information that I provided with that was not... Like I understand the thing at greater depth, but I can't put it into words. And sometimes what you're reading is probably like that, especially if it's a difficult concept. There's more that I want to talk about, but I don't want this video to go too long. And I think I'll make another second part of this as I jot down some notes and want to flesh out some other things. But my general consensus is that books give you a lot of knowledge, but they don't necessarily make you smarter. They don't always tell you how to use that knowledge. That's up to you, and you need your own intelligence to figure that out. Whatever intelligence you have, it's up to you to decide or get what you're going to get out of a book. And what stands out to you, what you learn from a book, is going to be different than what stands out to me when I read a book. So even reading Mortimer Adler's How to Read a Book, he just goes through techniques. He just says like stuff like how to quickly understand what a book is about to see if it's worth reading. He talks about reading about the same subject through multiple books. Basically, you can get several different points of view. That's like reading 4 different biographies of George Washington. If you read one biography of George Washington, you're not getting all the information. Hence, you read 4 different biographies of George Washington to have a better understanding. You start to see some things between them. Maybe one person focuses on one aspect of George Washington, maybe his generalship. Maybe another one focuses on his presidency. Maybe another one focuses on his early life. You never know. That was, I believe that was called syntopical reading. Which I think he made up that word. I'm not sure. But there was other readings. He had some instructions on reading science and reading the best books. And I'm going to have to reread his book because I read it probably 15 years ago. Actually, no, like 12 years ago. 13 years ago. It doesn't matter. I'm going to reread portions of it because I kept that book. I purged my books a couple last year, and his was one of the books I kept because I knew in my mind there's something I'm missing. There's something that I can still glean from this How to Read a Book, which I will review, which I don't think I reviewed it before. Maybe I did review it. I don't know. I will check my videos, but I will. It's worth rereading parts of it for me to understand more. But again, you can't talk to every expert out there. Whenever you get a chance to talk to an expert, usually you feel like you got a little smarter. So books they're placeholders. They can be inserted as imperfect versions of experts. You can't ask them questions. It's up to you to ask a question of a text and then figure out the answer for yourself. And this doesn't always go very well because you're limited, especially if nobody else has asked the question before and nobody else has an answer to it and you're all on your own trying to figure something out. So I guess ultimately you have to decide for yourself what is smarter to you, and can a book make you smarter? Well, if smarter to you is just, I will now have knowledge about this thing, then go ahead, go for it. Read a lot of books. You'll gain lots of knowledge. But you're not going to know what to do with all that knowledge. It's like a huge data set. It's like a ton of data that you get in input into your database, but you have to still figure out how you're going to structure the data and what algorithms you're going to use to pull from the data in order to make sense of it. So I think that's all I'm going to say about it for now. I mostly want to make this video because I've listened to a lot of videos of people talking about books, how they make them smarter, blah, 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 on YouTube. And I didn't really care for any of them because I didn't feel like there was anything personal or personable about what they made. It just seemed cut and dry kind of stuff that you would find in a book, that you would find in a classroom. And I think books are a lot messier and more organic than that, and deserve to be spoken about in a much more personal manner. Because each of us, if you read books, you would have read toward a personal knowledge, post-critical towards a personal knowledge. I don't remember. I can't remember the title of this philosophy book. And nor do I remember the author. This is off the top of my head. Yeah, it's not coming to me. But I read a philosophy book. This is because I read it like 15 years ago. Maybe longer. Maybe it's been longer than that. 16, 17 years. Again, doesn't matter. It was a while ago. I don't remember it. I think it was post-critical towards a personal knowledge, some kind of theory of that. Basically, it was a big, long philosophy book explaining about how a person's individual creativity, the individualism in a person, is ultimately what created their own personal knowledge, is ultimately what created new knowledge. And he used Einstein as one of his examples that I recall, and how if it weren't for Einstein's creativity, maybe, or his personal way of looking at things, maybe we would never have discovered relativity. I think maybe somebody else might have discovered something similar, but individuals' creativity matters, and it makes a difference in how knowledge is acquired and developed over time. The individual matters because all knowledge ultimately comes from a person. The first person to interpret an X-ray they had to figure out how to interpret it themselves. They saw an image that it created, and then they had to interpret and learn about that, and then they taught others. And this is how a lot of human knowledge is done. It's somebody initially learns it, and then it gets taught, and then people might be able to learn more about it or understand in a different way. So I wanted to just leave that with you. Whatever books you read, whatever books other people read, my reviews, other people's reviews, there's no one way to do it. And it's up to each individual in their own personal way that is shaped and molded by their life experience, in how you will gain from a text or not gain from a text. So I think I'm going to leave it at that. And as always, just read. And that's better than not reading. Okay, bye.